Who is the best player at each position in the NBA? Who's going to win the MVP this season? Who's the best defender in the league? What player would you start your franchise with? Who's going to win the title this season? All of these questions have been answered by NBA GMs at least. Every year, the league sends out a survey to every general manager in the league and asks them a ton of questions. Now, seriously, it's a lot. I'm not even going to be covering all of them in this video. But I am going to be covering everything that I mentioned in the intro and a bunch more. And it's always really interesting to see what the guys that are actually running the teams, that are locked into all this stuff day in and day out, actually think about the upcoming season. Let's begin with the positions. The GMs were asked who they think were the best players at each of these individual positions, of course, point guard through center. Let's begin with the positions and the point guard position. In order, this is how the results went. Third, we have Steph Curry with 23%, SGA in second at 30%, and the best point guard in the league, as voted by NBA GMs, was Luka Doncic with 37%. This is going to be a bit of a theme throughout the positions section of this video, where they weren't as strict about it as they typically are for things like All-NBA and All-Star voting. So SGA, Luka, you could debate whether or not those guys are point guard. You honestly could debate whether or not Steph is a point guard, but based off their voting criteria, this is how they land. And as a bit of a spoiler, there is a lot of love for the Oklahoma City Thunder in this video, beginning with SGA here at second best. And I think those are the two best lead guard kind of players in the league right now. The guys on the perimeter that have the ball every single time down the floor. Whether you count them as point guards or not is kind of irrelevant. This is how the NBA GMs have them. At shooting guard, again, in order from 3 to 1, we have SGA at 20% of the GMs, Devin Booker at 23%, and Anthony Edwards, I would say unsurprisingly, at 33%. He was arguably one of the main stories of the postseason last year and is the rising American star in the NBA right now. He's still super young, and amongst all of these guys in the league, I feel like him and Devin Booker most exemplify what you would typically think of when you think of a traditional two guard, a guy that doesn't have the ball all the time, although Booker and Ant do have the ball a lot and create a lot in on-ball situations. I don't think it's an argument that they belong more in the two guard spot than they do in the one guard spot. And I think if you had to guess before the video started where these guys would rank, having Booker and Ant 1 and 2, if you consider SGA a point guard, I think makes a lot of sense. As we get into the front court stuff, it gets a little bit weird again with the position. Small forward is actually 4 different guys. There's a 3-way tie for second. We have LeBron at 17%, KD at 17%, and Luka at 17% of the voting. Again, there's not a lot of clarity in terms of the positional rankings here because Luka's mentioned at both the 1 and the 3. SGA's mentioned at both the 1 and the 2. But the best small forward in the league, as voted by NBA GMs, is Jason Tatum, which is interesting. I'm not saying they're wrong. Obviously, if you think of the traditional small forward kind of role, Tatum certainly fulfills that. It's just been kind of a rough summer for Tatum between the team. I mean, obviously they won the title, but the Team USA stuff, he didn't make a single jump shot at all during the Olympics and didn't really play that much at all for Team USA. And then to consider him the best small forward in the league is certainly interesting. I'm not saying that they're wrong. It's just when you look at some of these other guys, I wouldn't have been surprised if they ranked Kevin Durant above him. I'm honestly pretty surprised that Luka isn't above him just because size-wise, I think people consider him to be a small forward, even though he's certainly that lead guard guy that we talked about earlier. But this one was certainly one of the more interesting ones. Next up now at the power forward spot, we have one of the biggest disparities of the entire video. Kevin Durant at 7% and Giannis Antetokounmpo with 77% of the voting as the best power forward in the league. I think it makes total sense. Positionally, there's no confusing where Giannis is at. You honestly could maybe put him at the 5 if you wanted to, depending on how many minutes he plays there with Brook Lopez's health and stuff this season, but no question that Giannis is the best 4 in the league. At the 5, there's 2 guys to consider, right? It's Embiid and Jokic. And you might think before the video that it would be pretty close to 50-50. It is not. It is Embiid with 10% of the voting, so 3 GMs in the league think that Embiid's the best center in the league, and 87% of them voted for Jokic. If you're wondering, the other 3% is Victor Wembanyama. That, to me, is very telling. Again, these are guys that are as locked into basketball as anybody on the planet, day in and day out, paying attention to this stuff, and that many of them still consider Jokic as the best center in the league. I'm not saying that they're wrong. I just would have expected the percentages to be a little closer. Let's move on now to one of my favorite parts here, the awards, beginning with the Rookie of the Year award. And a draft class that we all know isn't going to be sensational in terms of immediate impact, probably not in terms of long-term impact either. Sometimes it's just a bad draft class, and this seems to be one of them. But there's 2 main guys to look at here for Rookie of the Year. We've got Zach Edey of the Memphis Grizzlies at 30%, and Reed Shepherd is our winner here at 50% of the voting. Both of those make a ton of sense. These should be 2 playoff teams in the Western Conference. At least they're projected to be that way prior to all these injuries that could happen during the year, certainly with a Memphis team that has had bad injury luck over the last couple of seasons. But Edey makes a lot of sense as someone that is older, is probably going to be in a starting or close to starting role for Memphis for most of the season, and I think Memphis is going to be good. I think they're going to push to win 50 games, even in a tough Western Conference, and that's going to put him near the top of the Rookie of the Year race, especially in a class that doesn't look great at the top. Some more developmental players in Alex Sarr, Zachary Richeche in Washington and Atlanta, respectfully. The other guy here, and the assumed winner as of this survey, is Reed Sheppard. I personally would have voted for Zach Edey here because as good as I think Reed Sheppard is, there's a distinct possibility that he's just not playing as much as you would normally think a Rookie of the Year winner would, because there's so much depth there in Houston, whether it be in the backcourt, frontcourt. They've got like 12 guys that could play on any given night. And although I really like Reed Sheppard, I think he's going to be good, the possibility of him just not playing as much as we would expect, I think lowers his chances a little bit of winning Rookie of the Year, but certainly not a bad vote at all, and that's where the GMs are at. Next category, it's a one-person category. The best defensive player in the NBA, I didn't even bother putting any of the other percentages here because I don't think any of them are particularly interesting. 40% of the GMs in the NBA, the majority of them as of this voting, think that Victor Wembanyama is the best defensive player in the NBA. Not most versatile, not best interior defender, just the best defensive player in the league, most impactful defensive player in the league. And I took that as a, hey, this is who we think is going to win the Defensive Player of the Year award, is Victor Wembanyama. Wemby comes up a ton in this survey. Giannis, some other guys got some votes. I told you we're going to talk about Giannis a little bit later on in the video, but having that much of an impact already after just one season makes total sense, by the way. He's unbelievable defensively, can switch, can defend the rim. But Victor Wembanyama is the best defensive player in the NBA, according to this survey. Next up, let's talk about the best offseason moves category. 3 teams to talk about here. We've got the New York Knicks at 20%, the Philadelphia 76ers at 33%, and the winner of the category, the Oklahoma City Thunder at 37%. I honestly thought that this would be a little bit more heavily tilted towards Oklahoma City because I think a lot of the really smart basketball people out there really like the additions of Caruso and Hartenstein, but obviously you're grading a little bit on a curve there because the star additions for both Philadelphia and New York are certainly more significant, whether it be Mikal Bridges or Karl Anthony Towns for the Knicks, although this survey might have happened before the Cat trade. And then, of course, Philadelphia bringing in Paul George. Those are the 3 biggest, most flashy off seasons of the year. Certainly, if I had a vote here, I would vote for OKC. I think the Caruso Hartenstein acquisitions make them the favorite in the Western Conference, at least in the regular season, and that's more impactful than anything that happened in New York and Philadelphia relative to where that's going to land them in their standings this upcoming season. Next up, I did want to mention the Best Coach Award. It's Eric Spoelstra with 69% for this award. Not really that much competition. Some other guys mentioned, I think Mark, I always messed up his last name, Daignault for the Oklahoma City Thunder was actually in second place here, but Coach Spo, a lot of love throughout the league. Most likely breakout player, there was a ton of votes for a ton of different guys here. Evan Mobley, John Morant, and Victor Wembanyama all 3 tied at 10%. But the actual, I guess you could say, majority, the winner here is Jalen Williams of OKC with 13%. MVP voting, we circle back around to where we began the video with the best point guard category. SGA and Luka are the 2 favorites to win the MVP as of this survey. Luka with 30% and SGA at 40%. I think those 2 guys, if healthy, they're going to go back and forth all year long. Again, I would give SGA the edge there because I think OKC is going to threaten to win 55, 60 games if they're healthy the entire season. And as good as Dallas is, I don't know that the regular season is going to be that much of a priority for them, or they're just not going to be as good in the regular season because OKC is deeper, younger, all that stuff that typically trends more towards better regular season performance, which is a big deal in the MVP. You have to finish, unless you're Russell Westbrook and you average a triple-double, you have to finish pretty high in the standings to win MVP. Next up, this is always a go-to thing. It's kind of an award, and then we're going to get to who's going to win each conference, who's going to win the title. It's the who are you going to start a franchise with vote, right? And for years, it was Jokic. Giannis was in there for a while. Of course, if you want to go back even further than that, LeBron, KD, these kinds of guys come up. This was not close, and I was a little bit surprised because I thought maybe Jokic, Giannis, those guys would show up, although obviously they're getting a little bit older. It's Victor Wembanyama at 77%. SGA at 10% is the guy in second place here. It's not just hype. It's not just people on YouTube. It's not just people on the internet saying that Wemby could be a top 5, top 10 player in the league this year. It's not just us. It's these GMs around the league as well. They could pick one guy right now to start their franchise with. They would pick Victor Wembanyama, and I don't think they're wrong. He's young. He's got just incredible physical tools that you're not going to find in a draft, maybe ever. And I think certainly this is the right pick. I just, again, was a little surprised the percentage was that high. Now we get to talk about who's going to win the East, who's going to win the West, and who's going to win the NBA title this season according to these GMs. In the Eastern Conference, it is the Boston Celtics with 97% of the votes. I think the other vote was for New York, if I remember correctly. That, on one hand, makes total sense. Boston was the most dominant team in the league from start to finish last year, was never really that threatened in the postseason, even without Kristaps Porzingis for most of the postseason. And although the KP injury situation is going to be something worth monitoring this year, they are the same team again this year that was as dominant as they were last year. Now, there's always stuff when you're defending a title, it's always harder. You're playing later into the year. The prior year, you have less rest than everybody else. You're maybe a little bit less hungry. The Nuggets talked about that when they were trying to defend their title this year. It's just different when you've already won one. But from a roster perspective, you're looking at everything top to bottom. Boston is certainly the favorite in the East. 97% feels strong, but certainly the favorite in the East. It doesn't clarify if this is regular season or postseason in terms of who's going to be the one seed, but maybe this is more so one seed, and that's why there is such a disparity between the two. Next up, who's going to win the Western Conference? Again, this also makes me think it's a regular season thing. Oklahoma City with 80% of the vote. Now, if this is for who's going to win the most games in the Western Conference regular season, that makes total sense to me. From a postseason perspective, there's a ton of teams that can still give Oklahoma City problems from a matchup perspective. I'm not writing off Minnesota. I'm not writing off Denver, even teams like Phoenix. The West is absolutely loaded, so I don't think it makes sense to have an 80% vote for anybody in the Western Conference for the postseason. Regular season, though, OKC is the favorite to be the one seed. They're the favorite for best record in potentially the league. It's going to be them or Boston. So that makes total sense to me. And then who's going to win the finals? Again, I expected this voting to be closer. The Boston Celtics with an 83% voting share of who is going to win the finals. OKC at second with 13%. So it's always interesting to me to look at this GM survey. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it does provide some insight as to what some of the smartest basketball people, presumably some of the smartest basketball people on the planet, think about what is going to happen in the upcoming season and where all these players are within the hierarchy of the NBA.